We're very happy to have Paul Krassner with us today on Alternative Views. Paul was and is a legend both during and after his time. Paul's time was the 1960s, when his unique political journal, The Realist, contained some of the most advanced political satire and comedy of the day. Paul was also one of the founders of the Yippies, an anarcho-absurdist group that got national attention in the 1960s. Well, Yippies became Yuppies, but Paul Krassner lives on. Paul once again began publishing The Realist in 1984 and recently published issue number 104. Paul has also been traveling around the country doing his unique political comedy routine and is standing out once again as one of our most astute political comedians and commentators.
Along with our interview with Paul Krassner, we will intersperse sections of an interview which a friend of ours, Robert Wilkinson, did with Paul. His interview is in quite a different format from ours and covers different subjects. But before we talk with Paul Krassner and find out what's going in the wacky world of political and social satire, here are some news stories.
The first real scandal of the Bush administration was not really addressed in the mainstream media, and that is this tremendous $166 billion bailout for the savings and loan industry. During the deregulation era of the Reagan administration, when banks, savings and loans, as much as the Reagan administration could deregulate, was deregulated, the savings and loan industry went into an orgy of bad investments, of wasting money on all kinds of investments or boats for their executives or parties or orgies or whatever. And so hundreds of savings and loans administrations have gone out of business, have gone down the tubes, and the federal government and the U.S. taxpayer has been called in to bail them out. So we're in this tremendous deficit situation. All kinds of programs are being cut, social programs, and yet the U.S. government is giving $166 billion to savings and loan for a rescue operation. And economists, like in the London Economist, say that it could be as much as $300 billion to rescue the savings and loan. Now, it's very interesting what the other options to deal with the savings and loan problem could have been and how they weren't reported by the mainstream media. For instance, the representative from Massachusetts, Joseph Kennedy Jr., and another representative, Bruce Morrison, proposed a very rational program to help deal with the savings and loan problems. They proposed two specific taxes to pay for all of the savings and loans that were going out of business and to insure people's money, in which people that were making over $250,000 a year would pay a small tax to help the savings and loans out, and there would be a corporate profit tax that would also help pay off the savings and loan project. This is perfectly fair and reasonable, Kennedy and Morrison said, because the people that really benefited from the Reagan policies, from the high interest rates in the savings and loans during that era, in the stock market speculation that was connected with this savings and loan speculation, these people are the ones that have benefited, so they're the ones that ought to pay. Kennedy said, none of the people who enjoyed the benefit of Lear jets, none of the people who enjoyed the benefits of brokered S&L deposits, those aren't the people who are going to be asked to bail it out, that are going to end up subsidizing a lot of high flyers. And it seems the Democratic Party ought to be willing to stand up. And I think the Congress in general ought to be willing to stand up to some of the powerful interests in this country. Of course, the Democrats in the Congress weren't willing to stand up for it. So now, according to calculation, every tax-paying individual in the United States will have to pay $1,000 to $4,000 to help finance this savings and loan bailout, rather than a corporate or high-income tax that could have solved the same problem. And again, the media has just not touched this major scandal of the Bush years.
Well, the banks are the biggest stockholders in the networks, and they have people on the boards of directors of the networks, so they're not going to get into this. The Spotlight has had a lot of articles on it. They're right-wingers, but they're right-wing populists. That's why their opinions don't get on the regular media. But they've had a lot of articles on the S&L bailout. And they've quoted Congressman Gonzalez, who's the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, because he himself says that this is baloney what the Congress has actually passed, and he's been criticizing that. But of course, he doesn't get on the regular media either. But he says, and the Spotlight confirms, that in these S&Ls, over 60% of the cases that absolute fraud has been involved. More than 10,000 cases of suspected fraud, self-dealing, corruption, and outright thievery by bank executives have been tallied so far. But the thing that really grinds you is that in most cases, these clowns who drove these S&Ls into the ground and made all kinds of money out of it, they're being allowed to keep all their ill-gotten gains. Hundreds of failed savings banks and the top managers who are responsible for all that, they'll continue to draw their fat salaries and be paid after the bailout begins. And they even have, what do they call them, golden parachutes or some kind of parachutes, which allow them to, even if they're kicked out, they still will be able to draw enormous amounts of money. When I first came to Texas in 1973, I was looking frequently at the Texas Observer, and they used to do stories on banks, and almost many issues would show where these rich guys would go down to a small bank somewhere, and they would immediately start giving loans to themselves and their buddies. They would break the bank would go belly up, and they'd go off and do it to another bank. So it isn't unusual that the Spotlight gave an example of what this bailout's going to do and how the guys who were responsible for it are still going to benefit. They talk about a situation with former chairman of the Democratic Party, Robert Strauss, and his son Rick and their friends. They took over Gibraltar Savings and First Texas Savings. They had a merger. And then, of course, they got involved just like all the rest of them. The thing went belly up. They moved aggressively into junk bonds and real estate speculation, and so away they went. Now, there was another guy involved with them by the name of Aiken Gump. Now, he was a leading Dallas law firm, was a partner in it, in which Robert Strauss was a senior partner. Now, Aiken Gump was appointed general counsel to the banks that they had, and there also J. Livingston Kosberg was a multimillionaire Houston financier. He was involved in it too. So, what did they do? Well, many of the loans went to default, but the Strausses profited because Aiken Gump, through his law firm, was reportedly billing the bank $1 million a month for services, legal services, providing for doing foreclosures. The same year, Texas Gibraltar put up a whopping $135 million to buy the Flying M Ranch, which was 6,300 square acre outfit from Dallas. And that land development company was owned by Rick Strauss, all in the family. He got a big lavish deal from the bank. He got a management contract for the ranch at $3 million annual fee guaranteed for 25 years. And he stands to get 25% of any profits realized at the time the ranch is sold. Well, old Kosberg, who we talked about a while ago, he's got a good deal for himself. As chairman of First Texas Gibraltar, he arranged the sale of the bank's entire data processing system to a small company in which he secretly was a major shareholder. And this goes on and on, all these insider tradings which they had with each other. So what happens? Well, Danny Wall, the chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which took over First Texas Gibraltar, allowed these guys to run the bank into the ground, who ran the bank into the ground. He allowed them to keep their private bonanzas. All these deals that caused the thing to go under, he's let them keep it.
An investigator says Robert Strauss and his law firm are still general counsel to First Texas Gibraltar. Rick Strauss has kept his lavish contract to run the Flying M Ranch. The only difference here is that his yearly fee of $3 million is now being paid by the taxpayers. There's an old saying in Congress that the banks never lose. And meanwhile, the S&Ls are gone. They're, is finished, and the regular banks have now taken them over, and the FSLIC is no more. So all of the reforms of the New Deal years, in which they were trying to set up banks which would be used to help common ordinary people to buy homes, that system is destroyed and being taken over by the big guys back on Wall Street.
Curiously enough, Frank, I saw a pretty in-depth CBS report on that Rick Strauss scandal, although they had more of a development scandal that he was involved in, where a lot of the money he was getting from this bank wheeling and dealing, he put into a development project that turned out to be a lemon, and a lot of people lost a lot of money on it. It seems the media is eager to expose these scandals if they involve prominent Democratic politicians. Obviously, Robert Strauss being Rick's father, this shows badly on him. And of course, Jim Wright and some other Democratic congressmen had all of their financial dealings exposed in great detail in the media. So the way the media seems to pursue these kinds of stories is just as personal scandal, particularly ones that involve politicos, etc. They never really go into the systemic structures.
That's all the time we have for news right now. We'll have some more news later in the program. But now let's turn our attention to our interviews with Paul Krassner. Paul is a social critic, a political satirist, and does incredible comedy routines when he travels here and there around the country. He's also editor and publisher of The Realist, which is, well, you don't know if it's really satire or whether it's reality. But anyway, we have our two interviews, one we did with him and one which a friend of ours, Robert Wilkinson, did. So let's enjoy this first of a two-part series with one of the original Yippies.
Well, Paul, we're extremely pleased to have you with us today on Alternative Views. And what we'd like to do is to begin talking about the Iran-Contra hearings and then go into some of the history of the realist, Yippies and Yuppies, the 1960s, what you've been doing since then. Recently, you've been doing some commentary for Pacifica Radio, have you not, on the Iran-Contra hearings. What's your general sense of them, Ben?
It's sort of like the Marx Brothers with a political ideology. Just very strange. I mean, the bottom line for me is something that happened in 1984. People think that just because 1984 is past, that it's finished with. But there was a press conference when a reporter asked Ronald Reagan, why are we providing covert support to the so-called freedom fighters in Nicaragua? And Reagan answered, because it would be against the law to do it overtly. and that has stayed with me, the implications of that. It explains the consistency. If that's the basic premise, so it just means that the law is not something to follow so much as to get around, to continue doing what you want to do.
And that kind of rationale, I think, explains everything. It explains why lying has become our national purpose, because you need lying to support covert actions. So what they really, when you rip the shroud off of that sentence, it's really saying, if it's not a law, then we act to get around it. And so the pretense that this is a nation of laws, when it's really a nation of control.
What's the most glaring inconsistency in America today?
I guess it's the pretense that we care about people, that the government cares about people, when the government really cares about maintaining its own power.
So it's frustrating to watch that, and it's horrifying to see. You know what it's like? It's like satirical prophecy. Lenny Bruce had a bit where he talked about a politician who was a total crook but came out and admitted it, and people voted for him because at least he was honest about it. And that's coming true now with North.
Right.
You know, they're so hard up for a hero, they're willing to take a psychopath.
It's like a Bob and Ray routine, the corrupt mayor of Skunk Haven, New Jersey. You know, he openly admits it all.
That's right. That's right. If he can't be such a bad guy if he admits to you know, dropping the typewriter ball or whatever, he's scraping it. I mean, it's really very surrealistic. I mean, who could have imagined that somebody would become a hero because he was shredding documents while the Justice Department was investigating the same office? I mean, it's so bizarre that I think the country is kind of on a schizophrenic binge. And, you know, schizophrenics don't know they're schizophrenic.
In Watergate, people who destroyed evidence went to jail. But here they're heroes.
It's strange. Well, but it's just because everything's accelerating. I mean, Colonel North is probably very comparable to G. Gordon Liddy. And G. Gordon Liddy is a hero now, but since things are accelerating, it's more like fast food approach. You get instant heroism. So you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for as you had to wait with Liddy before he could, you know, become an actor on Miami Vice and a participant in Password with Betty White holding his hand and saying, "Here's the man who thought of assassinating Jack Anderson as a viable option. Let's hear a hand," you know.
Well, Oliver North thought of assassinating all the Ayatollahs as a viable action. That was one of his plans that, again, hasn't come out in the hearings. It's been published in the national news services. But no one has asked him about his plot to assassinate Iranian leaders. Just like Secord and these people had a plot to assassinate Sandinista leaders even before the revolution.
There's little bits of truth that pop out, though, you know, because when Lyman first asked Secord about the Christic lawsuit, he said it was preposterous, that it was a fairy tale. Right. But then, more recently, when Robinette testified, the CIA liaison, he testified that he was getting $4,000 a month from Secord to investigate the journalist who had instituted the La Penca bombing lawsuit. And of course, he's an electronics expert, so Robinette may well have been involved in, you know, because when he says investigate them, you can translate that as smear, you know, explode, whatever. We also saw a guy earlier on, I'm trying to remember his name, who testified that, almost in passing, that he was there at the capture of Che Guevara. You know, and you can translate that.
Felix Rodriguez, who goes back to the Bay of Pigs and
that's right.
all kinds of operations.
Right. So what happens is when Felix Rodriguez, codenamed Max Gomez, right. can testify that he went to George Bush's house, I think, to wish him happy birthday or something like that. Now, we know that Preppy George is not about to have what he obviously views as a greaseball come to his house, you know, get off my lawn, you know, unless you're going to stand in front of the mailbox. So it's just such obvious lying that you have to. I think humor for me has been like what Valium was to Robert McFarlane. You know, it's just one way of surviving the hearings.
Or maybe Oliver North. He looks like he was more and more tranquilized every day as the week went on. Yet he was obviously an effective witness for his cause. Why do you think people responded to North favorably?
Style. You know, I think it's as Fawn Hall said, she represented the American public when she said, "I do not retain substance." And so his style is kind of somewhere between James Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Tony Perkins in Psycho, you know, and so they can't quite pinpoint it, but they realize that there is this. He's already been pre-digested by the media in terms of his prototype.
Have you seen these Ollie in '88 or Ollie for '88 buttons?
What is that? Along with his medals, you mean there?
No, people want running for president and all that.
I know, but
God, that's scary.
and they don't even care that he never changes his clothes. You know, it shows what an understanding public there is.
What's even worse is that they're using these hearings as a medium for Sandinista bashing, and there's no truth coming out about what the Sandinista revolution is about and what the society is really. Absolute lies, and yet they're getting away with it by the media.
Turning it into propaganda. If they have that slideshow that they gave to the supporters, you know, it's just so outrageous that I have to sometimes take a walk and think, okay, this is really happening. You know, these guys are really, and what they all have in common is they're afraid for their jobs. Nobody wants to lose their jobs. That's why they follow orders, and it includes the journalists there, the photographers who have to keep clicking every time that the lawyer Sullivan whispers into the ear of Colonel North. They get a shot of it. You know, maybe they'll get something more, a different pose this time. Maybe they'll see the tongue in the ear, you know, and get on the cover of the National Enquirer.
Or a hustler, maybe.
Yeah. But they want to keep their jobs. The senators want to keep their jobs, so they won't criticize North, even if they feel critical of him, because they're afraid of what their constituency. So it's like everybody's operating on fear. The whole media operate on fear anyway, you know, especially the commercial media, where they instill fear in you, you know, of how your armpits smell, how your false teeth are going to fall out when you're performing a bank robbery. You know, I mean, it's how your crotch is going to drive people away. How, you know, if a Martian came to Earth and watched the media, they would think that this culture is fueled on fear.
Well, this is the whole appeal of North is fear of communism. Fear that there's going to be a domino effect in Central America, and they're going to come charging over the Texas border and take away the television sets and video recorders.
That's right. The only difference between Bernard Goetz and Oliver North is that Oliver North has a uniform. But you know, they share the same clinical paranoia. Bernard Goetz just was afraid of 4 guys in the subway, and North is afraid of the entire Sandinista government.
Although there's more grounds for fear in urban, you know, disintegrating urban context of crime. That's a rational fear than the fear of communism, particularly of the Nicaraguans, who posit no rational threat to anyone, but yet people are really afraid.
But that's the thing about a psychopath. They have their own logic. You know, I mean, so you can get somebody who's, you know, I'm hearing Johnny Carson through my teeth. I mean, that's a reality to them, and you could say, well, we'll go to a dentist and he'll take care of it. Say, no, the dentist is in on it. So they have to have a logic to fit their basic original premise. And even if they got a dentist he could trust who pull out of all of his teeth, you know, he'd say, I hear Johnny Carson through my gums now.
What does America need to look at and really lighten up about?
High tech and low sodium, I think, would fit the bill. America really itself, first of all, you know, our own power and how we have used it without compassion sometimes. I mean, it's something to laugh about and cry about alternately. You know, and our own tendency to try and reshape history. I'll give you a specific example. There's been sort of a media campaign to separate those who protested the Vietnam War from those who fought the Vietnam War. And it's a false dichotomy, because our slogan always was, bring the boys back home, you know. It wasn't slaughter them. And so it's appropriate that Country Joe McDonald just organized a Vietnam Veterans Film Festival, and he had been at a lot of anti-war rallies, but as he says, we were against the war, not the warriors. And so, you know, that's just a subdivision of general mythology. You can pick any subject and there's probably a myth about it. And a myth is as good as a mile. Stop that.
Paul, how do you deal with the contras in your comedy routines or your political satire?
Well, I try to talk about Fawn Hall's dating the son of a Contra leader, and try to imagine, you know, their pillow talk. You know, I destroyed another village today, honey. Oh, you know, let's practice safe sex, though, and be sure to wear contraceptives. Sorry, I have jokelexia. I can't help it.
Right. Well, actually, the contras are a difficult phenomena to make jokes about because of all the terrorist activity, because of all the actual killing they do in Nicaragua. I mean, this is not funny. I mean, it's a difficult topic.
Well, as a matter of fact, the cover of the current issue of The Realist has a cartoon by Nicole Hollander, who does the Sylvia strip.
Right.
And she's very political and a strong feminist, and comes from a union family, and is, because it's a perfect example of the trivialization of tragedy, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it says, and now, Mrs. Jones, for the dishwasher and the matching ottoman, can you name the group, sometimes called the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers, who has profited from smuggling plane loads of coke into the United States?
And she's saying, because the attention span is that, you know, is so zoom, zoom, zoom.
Yeah. What about Ronald Reagan? He must be a great subject for any political comedian.
Yeah, he's wallowing in Teflon now, and knee deep, up to his belly button already. And but when you know, political poisoning begins in the home. I heard that if you scratch Teflon, there's poison that seeps through. And so that's happening on a metaphorical level with Reagan. But when I learned that, I threw away my frying pan, which had scratched it, and realized that every time I'm cooking something in it, you know, I'm getting the poison underneath. So that it really does begin in, you know, with your own private relations, the politics, and then expands into national and international scenes. I mean, this is why the hypocrisy over Gary Hart was, you know, Americans aren't that concerned about adultery, but they had to go through the motions and do what I call the Elliott Abrams school of lying. You know, so he never says you're lying. You say I misspoke testimony, or as Oliver North says, it wasn't a lie. It was just what was the phrase he used? Plausible deniability.
Right, that's the
right. Plausible deniability.
Or you can lie. You can call somebody else a liar without using the word. You just say his memory differs from my memory. And so, in terms of deliberately misleading, that's what Gary Hart was doing. You know, saying, "Well, no, there was a side door," and then his wife got sucked into that lie. You know, if Gary says nothing happened, then nothing happened. And you know, when they were home, it was different. You know, he says, "Honey, would you get me a beer?" And she says, "Let that blonde bimbo get you your beer." You know.
Why is America, in your opinion, so hung up on banning four-letter words, since most people do them? You know, the F word, the S word, you know, and so forth. I mean, America's really hung up on it.
Well, I don't know if it's fair to say America is hung up on it. The FCC is hung up on it. I mean, Lenny Bruce got arrested in 1962 for saying cocksucker on stage in San Francisco.
The 10-letter word.
Right.
Right.
Beginning with C, and then your intelligent viewers can figure it out like a crossword puzzle. And 20 years later, Meryl Streep got an Academy Award for saying the same word, and in Sophie's Choice. And if she didn't get it, then Frances would have gotten it, and Jessica Lange would have gotten it for saying the same word in Frances. So so the taboos have changed, you know, but the FCC, of course, is just using the language as an excuse to attack a station like KPFK in Los Angeles for political reasons. You have to, but you can set a precedent like that, and it's easy to set a precedent with so-called obscenity, but it's all arbitrary, you know. So I can't go on a Pacifica station now and talk about finger, because even though I mean it as a noun, the FCC will insist that I meant it as a verb. So it's just a matter of translation. I can go on the media and
like to come.
Yeah, Lenny Bruce's bit to come. It's a four-letter word, or even the word dick. Now you can use dick if it's a person's proper name. You know, I can go on the media and sing my boy Dick, but I can't go on and talk about my dick boy. And what's the difference? Just a capital letter. It's a capital punishment issue.
Yeah, but okay. It's the psychology of the thing. You know, what is it? What is it?
Four-letter words are an easy target. You know, and a good subterfuge. They're not going to say, we're attacking you because KPFK is running the entire hearings with good commentary by Larry Bensky in Washington, and he interviews people from the Christic Institute who have the lawsuit to expose the secret team that does assassinations and gun running and drug running. So they can obviously say that's the reason. So in any society, they always go after the sexuality first because it's a cover for going after the political, and ultimately you can't separate the sexual from the political. Maybe a bundling board.
Well, I've always been wanting to ask you why you call your political journal The Realist. It sounds like surrealism, or if you read the stories in it or hear the kinds of stories you're telling now, why do you call this The Realist?
Well, I suppose in a certain sense that the title is the most satirical thing about the magazine. But I think it is, you know, the realism for me is kind of trying to maintain a balance between cynicism and optimism. And so that's reality for everybody. I mean, the big thing, of course, about reality is that it's totally subjective. And so that everybody who reads The Realist, you know, reads it through the filter of their own experience and projections. And I know that. And so when I meet people, especially when they have, say seen the book The Best of the Realists, which was the collection, an anthology of 16 years, and they'll say, you know, this particular cartoon or this particular article, and it's like a projective test. It's like a Rorschach, because it reveals more about them than it does about the realist.
Well, it always seems to me that our politics and our politicians in the United States in the 2 decades or so that you've been doing The Realist and your political humor lend themselves to satire. They're so absurd, ridiculous, and surrealistic in and of themselves that only satire, in some sense, can catch the absurd truth.
Oh yeah, it's because they try to master the illusion of sincerity. That's why Colonel North is so good. I mean, he reeks with sincerity, and so the satire is just almost something holding up a mirror to what they actually say, not even exaggerating. I mean, Ronald Reagan actually said in 1980, "If I am elected, I will end the inheritance tax for rich and poor alike." Now, where can I take that? You know, if I report that to people and they haven't seen it in the paper, they think I made it up already. You know, you just get the image of some wino saying, "And I bequeath my entire 6-pack of Ripple to my daughter." You know, it's or the time that John Hinckley shot the president, and Hinckley came out for gun control, and Reagan came out against it. You know, so who's the schizo?
Reagan himself, you know, the man is he. You hear all these people say, "Well, is he psychotic? Is he crazy? Is he senile? Or is he extremely shrewd? Or is he just the consummate actor who has lost the line between reality and script?"
Well, it's just the government by public relations. You know, you could see when there was the first Black Miss America, he called her up. When the hockey team won, he called them up. You know, it's always who would ever have thought that the president would be photographed with Michael Jackson? You know, this black kid with curly, greasy hair.
He's an androgynous figure.
Right, and wears a white glove and sings in a high voice.
Had a nose job.
Right, so he could look like Diana Ross. And wants to buy the remains of the Elephant Man. You know, I mean, so this surrealistic thing, but, you know, there are Michael Jackson fans who vote. And so it's all thought of as constituency. So it's all government by public relations. When Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys drowned in the Pacific, Ronald Reagan granted special presidential permission for him to be buried at sea. I mean, big deal. He could have just left him there. But, you know, they wanted to get the Beach Boy fans who vote.
What do you love about America, and what don't you love?
I don't know. I'm torn between the rocket's red glare by the dawn's early light or the twilight's last gleaming. I can't decide. Say that again. What do I like best?
What do you love about America? and what don't you love?
Actually, they're related. It's a paradox. What I love the least is that people have come into power in this country by a series of political assassinations that then made it look as if there were a mandate for the remaining candidates. And what I love most about America is that I have the freedom to say how rotten we are. It's a paradox. Got a paradox and 3 geese. That's a full house. What do you got?
I saw a newspaper article where it quoted you as saying social commentary is now taboo, assuming that was a correct quote.
Yeah, and actually I was quoting when I started, there had been an 11-year hiatus when I stopped publishing The Realist as a magazine and started again as a newsletter. And so I did a lot of media research and talking to people, and it was a TV producer who had said that to me, actually. A network producer said, well, you know, we maybe not use the language to say that cable can use, but we can deal with the concepts, you know, incest, abortion, euthanasia. We can deal with, but in terms of humor, he said, social commentary itself has become the taboo. And I think that's kind of the trend in comedians. You know, they talk about certain, you know, they'll talk cute stuff about Jim and Tammy Baker. They'll talk about the makeup, you know, and get into that, but it is literally and figuratively superficial. You know, I mean, when I talk about the new right, I'll talk about Pat Robertson and the fact that there are these layers of scandal. You know, he can be sucked into the vacuum created by the PTL. The 700 Club kind of gets tarnished with that same scandal, but it ignores there's a covert action information bulletin has his picture on the cover reviewing the Contra troops, and the CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, has been funneling aid to the Contras, and Oliver North has met with people from the 700 Club. I mean, the White House is filled with a bunch of Armageddon born-agains between Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese, who has said that he wants the White House and the National Security Council to be exorcised from demons.
Oliver North's another born-again weirdo.
Oliver North, definitely.
Casper Weinberger, the whole lot of them.
And these people, it's why there could almost be an organization, Anti-Semites for Israel, because they are anti-Semitic, but they're pro-Israel because they want all the Jews to be there when Armageddon strikes in the form of a nuclear holocaust. And so they feel everybody will be caught up, who's good by their standards, will be caught up in the rapture, and so they really have no sense, as in other cultures, you know, if we pass this law, what will it do for generations, 7 generations from now? They have no, it's like they have an MTV attention span.
Well, James Watt was saying that, so why should we protect the forest and the wilderness? Because the world's going to be destroyed in a handful or 2 years.
That's really why they had to let him go, because he was that blatant about it. I mean, and he's another example of government by public relations. Here was a guy, the truth was that he did a joke that was embarrassing to the administration, but they tried to make it look like a virtue when he left. You know, he said, well, I came to the Department of the Interior, and now my job is done. I'd like to spend some more time with my wife. I live with a wonderful woman, a black, 2 Jews, and a cripple. He didn't say that, but it was between the lines.
If you could change or add some new cabinet positions, what would they be? Secretary of what?
Well, I think the cabinet should be over there near the mirror. Then I think the sofa would go over here. Then I would go to the bathroom. I think the toilet should be on the left side near the window, and the bathtub, I think, at a kind of catty corner angle. The cabinet, who would I change? Well, and I think we would make George Shultz the Secretary of Doormat, because he's willing to be stepped all over now as long as he can keep his job anyway. I would make Allen Ginsberg the Secretary of Poetry and Pederasty. I think we would combine those 2 branches of government in a motion of efficiency. And I would make Oliver North Press Secretary, because He proved that you could lie with a straight face and still get people to donate money to the Contras.
Name some people who would have made great presidents, but never ran.
Marilyn Monroe, she made a great president. Let's see, who else? And she never ran.
Well, I mean, it's understood that the best people would never think about running because it would be totally insane, and insane people can't serve as president. And
what do you mean? It's a prerequisite. Just go right down the list.
Somebody once said, a fellow by the name of Johnson, lived a couple of centuries ago, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest. Now, if we go beyond the capitalism, communism, socialism, you know, as economic models of government, what type of government would you like to live under?
One which was able to reconcile the differences between the spiritual path and the economic path. Reconcile economic and spiritual and individual freedom. See, that's the trick of it. I'd really like to outlaw apathy, but I don't think I could get enough support for it.
We'll continue with our...
Paul's time was the 1960s, when his unique political journal, The Realist, contained some of the most advanced political satire and comedy of the day. Paul was also one of the founders of the Yippies, an anarcho-absurdist group that got national attention in the 1960s. Well, Yippies became Yuppies, but Paul Krassner lives on.
But before we talk with Paul, here are some news stories from the alternative press.
Well, the information on the history of the FBI's COINTELPRO program and the attack on civil liberties by the FBI, this information continues to come out, and it's even more surprising. North Carolina lawyer and journalist Alexander Charms learned from the Freedom of Information Act documents that the FBI kept confidential files on the Supreme Court from 1932 to at least 1985. There was over 2,000 pages of files. It reveals that the FBI wiretapped and monitored conversations of the justices, and that the court employees were used as informants as well. Documents show that Chief Justice Earl Warren and Justices William Douglas and Abe Fortas were specifically targeted covertly because they had upheld the rights of communists, according to the FBI. During appeal in the Rosenberg spy trial, the chief of the Supreme Court Security Police, Philip Crook, reported information overheard by his crew, and he kept special FBI agents advised of the arrival and departure of key persons in the case. That's remarkable. It's you remember the program we did about Red Scare, the book Red Scare, with Don Carlson, the author of Red Scare, and he said that the local Red Squads down in Houston in the police department were keeping dossiers not only on progressive or liberal people like Barbara Jordan, but also on the mayor and other civic leaders at the time. Incredible, and yet these FBI and all these people are still in our midst, still doing their bit.
If you could add 1 or 2 or 3 amendments to the Constitution, what would you want?
2 or 3 amendments. That the people shall decide which drugs are legal and which are illegal. Let's see, what else? In the matter of abortion, that life begins at the moment of foreplay. I would include that. Dentists would have to experience themselves whatever pain they gave you.
In Palestinian perspective, there is an article by a woman who is a doctor from England. She spent a lot of time in Lebanon and in the occupied territories. She has had some very interesting insights. She said in the summer of '82, when she was in the refugee camps in Lebanon and in Sabra and Shatila, she said, "I discovered the truth that Israel, a country that I had loved and respected all my life, had suddenly turned into a ruthless monster." She had treated some of the children, particularly, who had been hit by some of the weapons that the Israelis had had. She said, the first child I treated was a victim of a cluster bomb. Thank God he died, because if he'd lived, he'd have had no eyes, no face, no legs. She treated hundreds, thousands of children in coming in equally as hurt. Well, then later she went to Gaza, and when she was in Gaza, she was treating Palestinians, and she went to a prison and noticed that in the Gaza Central Jail, the prisoners were put 25 to each cell, often having to sleep on top of each other. To be found with a Palestinian flag, to be suspected of opposing the occupation by Israel, would earn long prison term. Never even mind throwing rocks at the Israelis. She said that most of her patients had either been beaten up by the army, the Israeli army, or had been shot by them. The abbreviation BBA, which means beaten by the army, appeared regularly on the medical records. There were patients with gunshot wounds carried to the emergency room by terrified relatives, little children, 5, 6, 7 years of age, teenagers, 13, 12 years of age. Occasionally the army, just for a little variety, they would shoot around the kids instead of directly at them. And in their panic, they would try to climb over walls. And then when they got up on the top of the walls, the army would start shooting around them then. And then the kid would get away from the shots there, they'd jump off the walls. And when they jumped off the walls, then they would break their legs and arms. And then they would come to her, and she would try to treat them. And the Israelis would write down, fallen off the wall while trying to escape from the army. She said she treated Palestinians with nasty high-voltage burns sustained as a result of being forced to take Palestinian flags, which had been put up on electric poles. The army had ordered the Palestinians to remove the Palestinian flags. It ties in with something in Harper's Magazine, a little section called Readings, in which it was reported people who saw Henry Kissinger in a kind of a secret meeting with a major American Jewish organization. He gave them advice on what Israel should do and what they should do. First of all, he said the Jews in the United States should not criticize Israel. But then he said Israel should bar the media from entry into the occupied territories, and then accept the short-term criticism of the world press for doing that, and then to put down the insurrection as brutally, overwhelmingly, and quickly as possible. Then he said they could ride out the bad press for a while and it would be all right. That's Henry Kissinger's formula for a lot of things, isn't it?
And as Henry Kissinger said, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac.
I have another story on Kissinger and his response to the brutal suppression of the Chinese movement for democracy in Tiananmen Square. Right after this brutal suppression that shocked the American people and the entire world, Kissinger was constantly on American television saying that he was aghast that Congress had voted to impose sanctions against China. He was constantly saying we had to accept the repression, that we had to understand Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese government. We had to keep our normalized relations with China. We couldn't risk losing this special relation that was developing. And the Nation magazine points out that at the same time that Kissinger was making these statements on behalf of the Chinese government, he was receiving fees in excess of $200,000 per year, or per client, for advising such corporations as Shearson Lehman, Hutton, Atlantic Richfield, H.J. Heinz, Union Carbide, Chase Manhattan Bank, Coca-Cola, and American Express. Each one of these countries does business with China. Each one of them wants to build more factories, to do more business, and this requires good relationships with the Chinese government. So at the same time that Kissinger is defending the Chinese government for their indefensible and brutal actions, he's on the payroll of all of these corporations. So the next time you see Kissinger on a television spouting off something about China, remember his own stake in U.S.-Chinese trade. It's just disgraceful that the networks like Ted Koppel on Nightline let him on so much in these talk shows, because he's a paid operative of these big corporations who has heavy interests in all of the things that he's making commentaries on.
What, in your opinion, will best bring about peace?
If we eliminate the bad guys.
Well, where but in Texas would more kids get beaten by the teachers and the principals? And Dallas is right at the heart of it. There was a big article in the Dallas Times-Herald, which is very good, indicating that hundreds of more than the 131,000 Dallas students get spanked every day. And according to Texas law, they don't even have to get the parents' consent before they start beating on the kids. Now, this is required by the policy of the Dallas Independent School District. As a matter of fact, if some principals don't report that they are spanking kids and how many of them they are, they get into trouble. As one official said, must be some difficulty here. I can't imagine them not having any problems with the kids down there. How come they're not whipping them, you know? Well, as I said, the principals and assistant principals can spank kids even if their parents request they don't. Children are not given a chance to tell their side of the story. There are no guidelines on what kind of instruments are to be administered, where they're to be administered, and with what type of paddle or whatever. But this practice is very thoroughly entrenched in the Texas schools. Only 2 school districts in the whole state have banned corporal punishment. In 1987-1988, Dallas schools, according to the Dallas Times-Herald, reported 6,274 paddlings. And the superintendent for elementary education warned the principals that they have violated the Dallas Independent School District policy if they don't beat their kids. Well, there are some organizations that are against this corporal punishment against kids, even national organizations. The American Medical Association, the National PTA is against it. The American Bar Association is against it, not even to mention organizations like American Civil Liberties Union. Well, the spanking of kids in Dallas, it's kind of at the whim of the principal. Some kids are only spanked for more serious things like fighting, but others can be spanked for tardiness or for not doing their homework. The principals and assistant principals say, well, there are some kids who that's all they respond to, because at home that's the principal means of discipline, and that's the only thing they recognize that will modify or change their behavior. If that's the only thing that happens at home to try to modify behavior, then that's the only thing that kids will respond to. Only 2 of the board members of the school board in Dallas are against this spanking. One of the people who's against it said, we're being hypocrites. In one instance, we're telling children not to be violent and physically abuse each other and a teacher, and yet we're physically abusing the kids. And the Supreme Court, in an interesting decision, said that it was okay to beat kids in school. There was a case of 2 little girls, I think they were 8 years old. They were giggling out in the hallway. Well, the principal didn't like that. By God, you're giggling. They took them in. They beat the little girls. And then sent them back to their class. And when they got in class, they got the giggles again, and the teacher spanked them. Well, the poor little girls were traumatized and didn't even come back to school for another week or 2. The parents took it to court. They were also under a doctor's care. Parents took it to court, and they lost. The trial court held in favor of the parents and against the school. The Appellate court ruled against the school and in favor of the parents, but the Supreme Court said, yeah, go ahead. Beat them kids.
The Honorable Judge Paul Krassner has been entrusted with making the punishment fit the crime.
Oh, yeah, that was one of my goals, yeah.
Televangelists.
And what's the crime? I have to decide what the punishment is? Do I have to decide what the punishment or the crime was? I mean, see, there's a philosophical part of me that believes that the crime and the punishment are the same process. But, you know, you're not going to stay a judge very long if, you know, because you'll dismiss all your cases that way. So you give me a punishment, I'll give you a crime, and I'll give you a punishment.
If the televangelist appeared before you
okay.
on the bench.
Oh, okay. I would just, well, I guess I would have them, as punishment, have to watch their own programs, just on a tape loop. You know, watch their pitches. I mean, we'll have Gene Scott harangue himself for hours. You know, just have Jerry Falwell talk about the Revelation and the beast, you know, and just have him tied to a chair watching himself doing it. I don't like the forced part of it, but you know, I'm a judge. I can do whatever I want.
Next case in front of your docket: defense contractors.
Defense contractors. I would have them meet the families of everybody who was ever injured by any of the products that they manufactured. That would be their purgatory.
The director of the CIA.
I would just bring him back to life. That would be enough punishment for him.
William Rehnquist.
I would just bring him back to life. That would be enough punishment. What would be appropriate for William Rehnquist? I think that I would...
Make him stay straight?
Do you know something about what goes on under those gowns? I would have William Rehnquist be sentenced to forced prayer in school. You know, I mean, he would have to pray. It would be like forced busing, so that you would bring religious students to non-religious schools back and forth, just for a balance of piety. And he would just have to keep praying and praying and praying. I mean, he could pray for better decisions. He would have the freedom to pray for whatever he wanted, but he would have to pray.
Ed Meese.
Ed Meese would have to give up prayer. He is really a religious fanatic. Ed Meese would have to be a clerk in an all-night pornography store.
Richard Nixon.
He would have to be a customer in an all-night pornography store. I am not a masturbator.
Oliver North.
Oh, Oliver North. What would he be? I think he would have to, he would have to, whenever a football game was won or a New Year's Eve was being celebrated, he would have to shred all the confetti that people threw out windows. Calendars, that would be his job. He would be the keeper of the shredder. He would have to shred wheat. You know, whatever needed to be shredded, that would be Ollie's job.
The Pope. Or the Catholic Church, it's, you know.
Well, now we have to deal with individuals here.
Okay.
I mean, you can't condemn an institution because an institution is, you know, have to take their leader. So the Pope...
It's next, yeah.
I think the Pope would get a job in a factory, working with the people on an assembly line, you know, a conveyor belt. His job would be to put condoms on test tubes so that we could have artificial sex but safe.
The Democratic Party.
The Democratic Party. They would have to unionize, I think. Democratic Party. I don't know. I guess they would have to. they would have to face the ghosts of past Democrats and explain to them what they had allowed to happen to the party, and to I guess they would have to get into a session of maybe go to a psychodrama and do role playing and pretend they were Republicans and see if there was really any difference in the way they acted.
The Republican Party.
I think the Republican Party would have to be homeless for 6 months of every year. They just have to live in the streets, and then it would probably affect their voting pattern, I would think.
Last, and of course least, everyone's favorite lame duck, Ronald Reagan.
What he...
Make the punishment fit the crime.
Oh my. He would have to do a press conference without his hearing aid, which is actually getting the answers from his kitchen cabinet, and so he would have to wing it. He would have to wing press conferences. He would not get any briefings. He would have to explain himself. He would just have to, and then he would have to watch the rushes so that he could see himself as others saw him. And he would have to expose the strings, you know. He's a marionette. That's not too well known, which is why he moves like that, just the strings. And we would have to show who the marionette operator was, you know. And it's a sort of a what do they call those big things? Begins with a C. Not what Lenny got arrested for, but it's. But although they work in these places, they buy things not condo.
Conundrums?
No, but it's like that. It's like that. Now, conundrums are prophylactics that you can't quite get on.
Who do you think is the puppeteer?
Well, it varies. You know, it's some people from the Bechtel Corporation, some people. You know, it's from the liquor industry lobby. It's a sort of a joint operation there, but I think it would be to expose the Wizard of Oz nature of the government, you know, and so that just pulling the curtain from behind Reagan to show who's manipulating the strings, and then let him continue doing it. You know, I mean, but just let it be out front. I would like that, and I would also like to put George Bush in charge of selling clean urine to basketball players.
Well, although it's true that there's been a taboo on social criticism and satire in the media, to some extent there's been something of a rebirth of political humor since the Iran-Contra affair began, at least on the cabaret level. I was in Los Angeles this spring, and all of the comedy clubs were having a great time with the Iran-Contra hearings. And more recently, I saw on television that in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of political cabarets that have sprung up that have been having great fun. And you've been traveling around
and
the
there was
country.
a political humor forum in Washington, but they have people like Mark Russell, who is sort of the poor person Steve Allen. They have Art Buchwald, who has, you know, lunch with Henry Kissinger. I mean, Mort Sahl now is supporting Alexander Haig for the presidency.
Are you kidding?
No, this is true. In fact, it was Mort Sahl who gave Haig the line, "I'm throwing my helmet into the ring." But if you think about it, Mort Sahl has always gone with the power structure. You know, even though he supported John F. Kennedy, he also supported the Bay of Pigs. So, you know, he just became sort of a latter-day Will Rogers. But
well, and yet in the early '60s, you know, he would take on Richard Nixon, and he did a lot of sharp satire on that ilk.
And then he fell into hard times and has become rather bitter about it because
and a lot of his
so what happened?
A lot of his performance now. Well, a lot of his performance is based on name dropping, how he got invited to have dinner with the Reagans at the White House, and how all the Hollywood liberal establishment, like Paul Newman, and who else is the Hollywood liberal establishment? Yeah. Ed Asner and
Jane Fonda.
Yeah, Jane Fonda. They came to him and said, you know, you should boycott. Don't go to the dinner at the White House. And I personally thought, you know, I felt that way, but then part of me got self-righteous because I thought, well, if I got invited to the White House for dinner, would I go? You know, it would be such a grist for my satirical mill, and to be in the belly of the monster. But of course, that's such a hypothetical case that I can't even deal with this.
Well, that's what Mort saw. I saw a thing on TV. He was talking about this very situation, and he was saying, well, after spending the evening there with Reagan, he realizes that Darwin's theory is blown out of the water. Survival of the fittest hasn't occurred in Reagan's case.
Well, except that Reagan is about to reveal that it was Bonzo who first told him about the theory of creationism. So this is the reconciliation between those two.
It sure wasn't Bonzo who started the AIDS. It was some monkey in Africa, wasn't it? Maybe that's how it got started.
Oh, I'll tell you, I saw in the airport Lyndon LaRouche people with signs that said, mosquitoes don't wear condoms. And at first I didn't understand. I thought he was talking about the mosquitoes in Nicaragua, the tribes. But he was talking about AIDS and how in Africa and Florida there are mosquitoes that actually can transmit the AIDS virus. So I had to assure him that it was only if they shared their needles.
Right.
What inspired you to start doing what you're doing?
Well, you got an itch, you scratch it. It was just a survival for me, you know. I mean, people wake up to the fact that they're Martians at different times in life. I woke up to it early, and I realized that I would have to learn to pass as an Earthling if I wanted to survive. And so I used humor as my vehicle, because laughter is what I imprinted on in terms of you know, waking up to the mystery of your own existence. Everybody has that, and some people go back to sleep because the world is just too painful to bear. And so you need to imprint on something to deal with all the pain and the horror that there is in the world, to allow you to, you know, to focus on some of the beauty and the pleasure too. And if you want to be a well-rounded person. And so for me, humor became my religion, in effect. I mean, it's just my way of perceiving the world. I mean, everybody has to have a metaphor for the mystery. I mean, because life is a mystery. If it's not a mystery, what the fuck is it? That's my philosophy.
Well, so what's your role? What do you see your role as being?
Oh, I guess I'm sort of court jester of the revolution. Or maybe poppy seed. I'm not sure. It's hard choosing roles.
Well, of all the sages and philosophers,
maybe a sage role, that would be good.
Well, I was going to say, many of the sages and philosophers seem to be political satirists. Who's your favorite, and why?
Well, Lenny Bruce was the one who influenced me the most, because he went all the way. You know, he just, he balanced on the edge, and then he realized that the edge was infinite. And so even though he's dead, you know, I still relate to him as a touchstone for the tradition that I'm trying to carry on, that he was part of.
Who are some of the other major...
well, Mortzall did too. I mean, you know, he may be bitter now, but, you know, he was a pioneer.
Right.
Richard Pryor, Lily Tomlin. There are, you know, I'm influenced. There's a thing that Lenny Bruce said. That's what he said, actually. He had a bad cough. He said two things that were, one was that I am part of everything I indict, which I think is important, because we all have a little Oliver North in us. But he he said, I am influenced by every waking moment of my life. And so you know, the people whose humor I admire can come from anywhere. I heard about a ghetto kid in Austin, 7 years old, who, when he saw that photograph of Michael Jackson in this health chamber of some sort that he wanted to rejuvenate himself in if he ever got old, and this kid just effortlessly said, oh, he's just trying to freeze-dry his AIDS. That was a 7-year-old ghetto kid.
Wow.
You know, think of the cynicism and the sophistication that comes from that. Johnny Carson's writers who get $5,000 a week to write jokes about unemployment, would be hard-pressed to come up with those kind of cultural connections. Mm-hmm. So there's an awareness that kids have today that they didn't have when I was a kid.
But it also points to your theory of humor as being a self-protective mechanism. You take the things that are most frightening and most threatening, like AIDS or Iran-Contra or Oliver North or nuclear weapons, and you somehow turn your fear into you overcome your fear.
That's why I said I was so influenced by this 7-year-old kid. I mean, I heard this a couple of days ago, and I've just been thinking about it, the implications of it, because it also means it's a way of the kids saying, one of my interpretations of it is that it's a way of the kid dealing with being a ghetto kid by saying, you know, even Michael Jackson can't protect himself from that kind of fate, if that's what his fate is.
Right.
Paul, you also wrote for Mad Magazine and wrote for Steve Allen. Did you write for Steve Allen first when he was on TV? Is that?
This was a freelance basis. The old when he had his show on, I did a couple of sketches. I did a song that I wrote, and he put the music to, called Cosa Nostra. It was a romantic ballad, Our Thing. Had lines about, I give you the kiss of death. Steve Allen has always been, he has a mailing list, I don't know of how many hundreds of people that he sends articles to, Xeroxes of articles that have interested him, you know, about whether it's mafia influence in the Teamsters or Teamster influence in the mafia. Although he's kind of, now he's doing some kind of Brand Flakes commercial, but you know, I guess it comes out one way or the other.
If you could give America the good news, bad news, what would it be?
Well, that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists periodically publishes on their cover a clock showing how many minutes we are to midnight, midnight representing total nuclear disaster. And recently they moved it up from 4 minutes to midnight to 3 minutes to midnight. Now, I'm not sure what their time scale is, whether a minute represents a month or a year or a decade, but whatever it is, we are now 3 minutes to total nuclear holocaust. So I would say that's the bad news. The good news is that atomic scientists are just as neurotic as the rest of us. They set their clocks 15 minutes ahead. So the good news is really 18 minutes to total nuclear doomsday. We have that extra time to fool around in.
What would you say has been the greatest political prank ever played? Yeah, besides maybe the election of Ronald Reagan 6 years after we turned Nixon out. I mean, yeah, there has to be some other prank.
The greatest political prank ever played. Well, I guess the Bay of Pigs might fit into that category. You know, and I suppose if Kennedy had gotten air cover from the CIA, that would have transformed it from the prank category into the hoax category. Well, I guess the notion that Democrats and Republicans are really that different, I think, is probably the greatest political prank. You know, the illusion of a two-party system, when it's really several parties. You know, the Lockheed Christmas party, the Northrop Christmas party. It's a multiple-party system.
And when did you begin the realist? It was 1958. What led you to do this at the end of the McCarthy period and the Eisenhower
years? It was the McCarthy period. It was the frustration at MAD that they didn't want anything that wasn't for teenagers. I wanted to do something on unions, in fact, and they said, no, it's too adult, just the subject matter. They wouldn't even look at it. The first thing I sold to Mad was a thing called if comic strip characters answered those little ads in the back of magazines. And I would just write the script, and it was illustrated by Wally Wood, the late Wally Wood, who did the Disneyland and Memorial Orgy in The Realist. When Disney died, I just said, just let your imagination flow and show us what would have happened now that these people who no longer have the restraints that Disney put on them, you know, what would these characters do? And so you had Goofy and Minnie Mouse humping on a cash register at Disneyland, while Mickey Mouse was shooting up, and Dumbo was defecating on Donald Duck, you know, screaming back at him, and Tinkerbell was doing a striptease for a bunch of people, and Pinocchio's nose got longer as he watched, sort of displaced arousal. But in this article I did for Mad on the things that comic strip characters would answer in the little ads, we had like Little Orphan Annie answering the ad for Maybelline so she could get some makeup on her blank eyes, and Alley-Oop getting rid of his superfluous hair. And one of the things was olive oil sending away for falsies because she was very flat-chested, objectively speaking. And they didn't want to run that. They thought it was funny, but Bill Gaines, the publisher, said to me, look, you know, I know my mother will object to that. And I said, yeah, he was 35 years old at the time. I said, yeah, but, you know, she's not a typical reader of Mad. And he said, no, but she's a typical mother. And so there was that thing, you know, you want to rock the boat, but, you know...
Within limits.
Within the limits, yeah.
So you wanted to go over the limits.
I didn't want to think about limits. I just wanted to, I mean, I have my own limits. I mean, because I have paradoxes. On one hand, irreverence is my only social cow, my only sacred cow. On the other hand, I don't want the victims to be the target of my humor. So even though I'll talk about AIDS, somebody who is suffering from AIDS is not the target of my humor. The target of my humor is my own fears and inhibitions and hypocrisies, and by extension, those of the audience. The other paradox is that in my own Zen bastard spiritual quest, I try not to judge people, which is pretty bizarre for a social critic. But it's a challenge because one form of satire is to see things from the point of view of the executioner, you know, because they as I said before, they have their own logic. And I think the most outrageous thing I ever saw any comedic performer do on stage was when Lenny Bruce took things from the point of view of Adolf Eichmann, sympathetically, you know, trying to say, well, I went to the ovens every day and I looked through the porthole and I saw I had done my job well that day and I went back home. Now, he didn't get many laughs during this, but he did it in a nightclub to an audience which probably had a lot of Jews in it. And I asked him about this later, because when I first interviewed Lenny, he said the function of a comedian is to get a laugh every 15 to 25 seconds. I mean, he was very precise about it. And now he would sometimes go off rambling, you know, and talk about his court cases, and because he always talked about his environment. Now his environment just happened to be paddy wagons and courtrooms more and more. And I said, you're not getting those laughs every 15 to 25 seconds now, Lenny. And he says, well, they said, that was my definition of a comedian. I'm not a comedian, I'm changing. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm not a comedian, I'm Lenny Bruce. So he saw himself as a symbolic, that he had assumed a function in society. It wasn't just that he was a comic anymore. He knew that he had become a symbol because, in fact, his FBI, I got his FBI files. I got Helen Keller's FBI files, too.
That's right, she was a socialist. Huh?
Well, in fact, there was a great thing. J. Edgar Hoover said that they should keep files on her. In fact, he refused to, because she got a birthday card from Helen Gurley Brown. She sent a birthday card to Helen Gurley Brown when she was in prison at the age of 65. So obviously, Helen Keller, deaf, dumb, and blind, was a dangerous subversive.
Helen Gurley Brown was the wobbly one from the IWW, right?
I thought she was the editor of Cosmopolitan.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't know. They're all interchangeable.
You're right.
Elizabeth
right.
Gurley Flynn, maybe.
That's it.
Right,
Okay,
right.
I've got IWW. You know, that's the problem with today's mixed-up world. When you mix up the wobblies with
Cosmopolitan, that in itself is the kind of political satire.
I know. Well, that's the thing, that the attention span, it's so quick that people hear Abby Hoffman now say, isn't she the state senator from Arkansas? You know, it's Amy Carter. I think she's with a new punk group, isn't she? I mean, people really forget. And yet, the fact that Abby Hoffman and Amy Carter were co-defendants in that CIA recruiting suit, which they won. I went to the victory party. And it was very significant because Lenny Weinglass, the attorney for the case, we asked him, what do you think was a turning point in the jury's consciousness? Because that set a great precedent. And he said, well, it was when Ralph McGehee testified, the former football player who was recruited by the CIA right off the playing field and ended up in their assassination squads. And they made the point that in the 60s, they would not have been able to use this necessity defense because the jury wouldn't have believed that the CIA did things like that. But they'd become jaded and sophisticated enough that they were prepared to believe that kind of testimony.
That's parallel with what John Stockwell, former CIA person who wrote In Search of Enemies, had to say. He would write stuff, and the editors of the book who were looking at it before it was published, they'd say, we can't publish this, nobody believe it. And Stockwell would say, but it's real, it's what really happened. And they say, no, nobody believe it.
Yeah, I know. In The Realist, I published work by Mae Brussel, who was a conspiracy researcher from Carmel, California. And she, in an article called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, she delineated the conspiracy behind the Watergate break-in, which was still being called by the mainstream press a caper, a third-rate burglary. And she named Nixon and L. Patrick Gray and John Mitchell because she had been doing research into the Kennedy assassination since '63. So she saw the same personnel involved. She saw the same modus operandi. And this was 9 months before it actually came out in the mainstream press. And so people then were telling me, you're crazy. They were not prepared to believe it. You know, when the truth came out, I felt vindicated. And, they say, well, you were crazy, but you were right.
It's probably the same thing with these drugs today, the theories of the Contras being drug runners. A lot of people probably just don't believe this at all. And then eventually the information will come out. And the critics, like the Christic Institute and yourself and Alternative Views, will be vindicated.
Well, but it's not, the key is, it's not just the Contras doing it on their own. They're doing it in relationship with the CIA.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
And even George Bush's office.
Oh, yeah, George Bush, we're really waiting to come out from behind the bush. I mean, there is a theory that he was the one who gave the go-ahead on the Lapenka bombing. This is where Eden Pastore was going to hold a press conference. And it gets confusing to people because they say, well, why would they want to get rid of him? And you have to explain, well, see, he was a Contra, but he wasn't one of our Contras.
He was not unifying with the other groups.
He wasn't following the CIA's orders.
Right. Paul, during the Watergate era, you had a lot of fun satirizing the Nixon administration. How do you see comparisons between the Iran-Contra scandals and hearings and the Watergate affair and hearings? And also from the standpoint of humor, what are the differences that it presents for satirical targeting?
Oh, well, this came out. There was a humor conference, an international humor conference, and there were 5 delegates from Russia. And they asked an American performer like me. It was a kind of interesting thing for me as the editor of an American satirical magazine to meet the editor of Crocodile, which is this Russian satirical magazine, but supported by the state there. So they have a lot of humor about absenteeism and productivity. And as one of a former editor there who edited the book of Russian underground humor told me, he said that the humor in Crocodile is for the state, it's not for the people. And so I was one of a few people invited to try and make these Russians laugh. And I tried to pick something that would demonstrate freedom of expression in this country. Again, that paradox that we have, that political candidates have gotten into office by dint of assassinations that then made it look like they were brought in by a mandate. and yet we have the freedom under the First Amendment to talk about how rotten we are. So I try so the story I told was, in answer to your question, was comparing the Watergate scandal and the Contragate. And there, of course, we had the smoking gun. We had the 18.5 minutes missing from Nixon's tape, which, of course, General Haig referred to as being caused by sinister forces. I was telling you, there's a bunch of nuts around that White House. And so, I've lost the nut vote now. Poor politics. So, what do we have comparable to that? You know, in Irangate, we had only the brain surgery on William Casey, where they removed the section from August 1985 to November 1986. So, you know, that I began to get suspicious. And so as I told that story there, it was translated. You know, I would pause, and then the American audience would laugh, and then it would be translated, and the Russians would laugh. And so, you know, they both laughed at that. So it was kind of a kind of unifying humor. And of course now, you know, just the notion of obviously Casey is going to become the scapegoat because dead men don't talk. Right. And Poindexter will testify that he reported to Casey, and so we'll never know if Casey reported to Reagan. So it's a very convenient death, you know. And I suspect that soon the Ollie and 88 buttons will be replaced by Who Killed Casey buttons.
I mean, I think that the laugh tracks on TV sitcoms, I know all North yet, are the lowest form of fascism. So is Ollie Lords. Yeah, totally. I mean, what is more fascistic than a machine telling you when you have permission to laugh at something, telling you whether or not something is funny? And what it does, it changes your nervous system. If you hear it long enough, then you hear something on TV that you think is funny, but there's no laugh track, and you find yourself waiting a split second for that sound to give you permission. And so it affects you. I saw a Phil Donahue show, and he asked this question: what does the Bible have to say about vibrators? Now, I waited. Maybe this is a serious theological discussion. Well, from Ecclesiastes, there was a time for manual dexterity, there was a time for vibrators. Then I saw the hearings, the parole hearing of Sirhan, and there was a woman on the parole board who said, Mr. Sirhan, let me ask you a question. He said, oh, please, that's not necessary. Call me Sirhan. Again. I couldn't be sure if obsequiousness was part of his religious tradition, or he was just being silly. I mean, happy Lord, Sirhan, or with a little initial, Sirhan B. Sirhan, happy Lord, Sirhan B. Sirhan.
Name one or two or three people in America today that are relevant that people can learn from.
Anybody they meet. You know, everybody you meet is relevant and you can learn from.
What's Paul Krassner's next goal?
What's my next goal? To be a champion hockey player. What's my next goal? Or maybe a circus giant. I can't decide. Maybe I should take a vocational aptitude test. I mean, there's projects. You know, I want to continue editing The Realist and performing and doing freelance writing. But there's a couple of books, a few books I want to put together. One's a collection of pieces that I've done. It would either be called Murder at the Humor Convention or I Snorted Cocaine with the Pope. I mean, one's a kind of classy title, the other's a little bit more commercial. And then there's another is an autobiography, which is unauthorized. I'm writing it against my better judgment. And then the other is a novel based on a controversial comedian that was inspired by Lenny. So you know, there are projects that I want to do, but there's so many unknowns. You know that I guess my chief goal is to act as if process itself were my goal, and then it saves a lot of disappointment. You know, if you get hit by the bus just before your book comes out.
General counsel to the banks that they had, and there also J. Livingston Kosberg was a multimillionaire Houston financier. He was involved in it too. So, what did they do? Well, many of the loans went to default, but the Strausses profited because Aiken Gump, through his law firm, was reportedly billing the bank $1 million a month for services, legal services, providing for doing foreclosures. The same year, Texas Gibraltar put up a whopping $135 million to buy the Flying M Ranch, which was 6,300 square acre outfit from Dallas. And that land development company was owned by Rick Strauss, all in the family. He got a big lavish deal from the bank. He got a management contract for the ranch at $3 million annual fee guaranteed for 25 years. And he stands to get 25% of any profits realized at the time the ranch is sold. Well, old Kosberg, who we talked about a while ago, he's got a good deal for himself. As chairman of First Texas Gibraltar, he arranged the sale of the bank's entire data processing system to a small company in which he secretly was a major shareholder. And this goes on and on, all these insider tradings which they had with each other. So what happens? Well, Danny Wall, the chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which took over First Texas Gibraltar, allowed these guys to run the bank into the ground, who ran the bank into the ground. He allowed them to keep their private bonanzas. All these deals that caused the thing to go under, he's let them keep it.
Corporations have gone out of business, have gone down the tubes, and the federal government and the U.S. taxpayer has been called in to bail them out. So we're in this tremendous deficit situation. All kinds of programs are being cut, social programs, and yet the U.S. government is giving $166 billion to savings and loan for a rescue operation, and economists like in the London Economist say that it could be as much as $300 billion to rescue the savings and loan. Now, it's very interesting what the other options to deal with the savings and loan problem could have been and how they weren't reported by the mainstream media. For instance, the representative from Massachusetts, Joseph Kennedy Jr., and another representative, Bruce Morrison, proposed a very rational program to help deal with the savings and loan problems. They proposed two specific taxes to pay for all of the savings and loans that were going out of business and to insure people's money, in which people that were making over $250,000 a year would pay a small tax to help the savings and loans out, and there would be a corporate profit tax that would also help pay off the savings and loan project. This is perfectly fair and reasonable, Kennedy and Morrison said, because the people that really benefited from the Reagan policies, from the high interest rates in the savings and loans during that era, in the stock market speculation that was connected with this savings and loan speculation, these people are the ones that have benefited, so they're the ones that ought to pay. Kennedy said, none of the people who enjoyed the benefit of Lear jets, none of the people who enjoyed the benefits of brokered S&L deposits, those aren't the people who are going to be asked to bail it out, that are going to end up subsidizing a lot of high flyers. And it seems the Democratic Party ought to be willing to stand up, and I think the Congress in general ought to be willing to stand up to some of the powerful interests in this country. Of course, the Democrats in the Congress weren't willing to stand up for it. So now, according to calculation, every tax-paying individual in the United States will have to pay $1,000 to $4,000 to help finance this savings and loan bailout, rather than a corporate or high-income tax that could have solved the same problem. And again, the media has just not touched this major scandal of the Bush years.
Well, the banks are the biggest stockholders in the networks, and they have people on the boards of directors of the networks, so they're not going to get into this.
The Spotlight has had a lot of articles on it. They're right-wingers, but they're right-wing populists. That's why their opinions don't get on the regular media. But they've had a lot of articles on the SNL bailout. And they've quoted Congressman Gonzalez, who's the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, because he himself says that this is baloney what the Congress has actually passed, and he's been criticizing that. But of course, he doesn't get on the regular media either. But he says, and the Spotlight confirms, that in these SNLs, over 60% of the cases that absolute fraud has been involved. More than 10,000 cases of suspected fraud, self-dealing, corruption, and outright thievery by bank executives have been tallied so far. But the thing that really grinds you is that in most cases, these clowns who drove...
We're very happy to have Paul Krassner with us today on Alternative Views. Paul was and is a legend both during and after his time. Paul's time was the 1960s, when his unique political journal, The Realist, contained some of the most advanced political satire and comedy of the day. Paul was also one of the founders of the Yippies, an anarcho-absurdist group that got national attention in the 1960s. Well, Yippies became Yuppies, but Paul Krassner lives on. Paul once again began publishing The Realist in 1984 and recently published issue number 104. Paul has also been traveling around the country doing his unique political comedy routine and is standing out once again as one of our most astute political comedians and commentators.
Along with our interview with Paul Krassner, we will intersperse sections of an interview which a friend of ours, Robert Wilkinson, did with Paul. His interview is in quite a different format from ours and covers different subjects. But before we talk with Paul Krassner and find out what's going in the wacky world of political and social satire, here are some news stories.
The first real scandal of the Bush administration was not really addressed in the mainstream media, and that is this tremendous $166 billion bailout for the savings and loan industry. During the deregulation era of the Reagan administration, when banks, savings and loans, as much as the Reagan administration could deregulate, was deregulated, the savings and loan industry went into an orgy of bad investments, of wasting money on all kinds of investments or boats for their executives or parties or orgies or whatever. And so hundreds of savings and loans administrators...
These SNLs into the ground and made all kinds of money out of it. They're being allowed to keep all their ill-gotten gains. Hundreds of failed savings banks and the top managers who are responsible for all that, they'll continue to draw their fat salaries and be paid after the bailout begins. And they even have, what do they call them, golden parachutes or some kind of parachutes, which allow them to, even if they're kicked out, they still will be able to draw enormous amounts of money. When I first came to Texas in 1973, I was looking frequently at the Texas Observer, and they used to do stories on banks, and almost many issues would show where these rich guys would go down to a small bank somewhere, and they would immediately start giving loans to themselves and their buddies. They would break the bank would go belly up, and they'd go off and do it to another bank. So it isn't unusual that the Spotlight gave an example of what this bailout's going to do and how the guys who were responsible for it are still going to benefit. They talk about a situation with former chairman of the Democratic Party, Robert Strauss, and his son Rick and their friends. They took over Gibraltar Savings and First Texas Savings. They had a merger. And then, of course, they got involved just like all the rest of them. The thing went belly up. They moved aggressively into junk bonds and real estate speculation, and so away they went. Now, there was another guy involved with them by the name of Aiken Gump. Now, he was a leading Dallas law firm, was a partner in it, in which Robert Strauss was a senior partner. Now, Aiken Gump was appointed general